Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Beijing Forum. I want to thank the hosts for a terrific job. It's not every day that you get a shuttle bus to take you the equivalent of a quarter of a mile, and I appreciate all the good service. What I want to do is take a look at the role that institutions may be playing in East Asia, particularly as it relates to the goals that are spelled out in this program, namely the development of mutual trust, cooperation, and sharing. In order to do that, let me start with the following point. It seems to me that Asia is creating what you might think of as a new order. This is very complicated. There's been a lot of literature study on this, but essentially we've seen big changes in the security arrangements in East Asia as bipolarity has come to an end, and we've also seen major changes in the links between finance and trade and investment across the region as the power of global finance has increased its capacity to penetrate into beyond national boundaries. And the central question that I want to address with you today is whether this new order is going to be peaceful or contentious, and whether or not, or the ways in which institutions may be able to play a role in reducing or mitigating some of the potentials for threat or conflict. So that's my starting point. And with this, let me start by saying it seems, particularly if you look at the popular media and an awful lot of political speechifying, that the institutions that have been created around East Asia are in many ways seen as competitive with one another. If you think about the issue of finance, we have the IMF on the one hand and the World Bank versus the AIIB, the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, the One Belt, One Road, and it's generally being perceived as American-led institutions on the one hand and China-led institutions on the other, and that this is something of a zero-sum game. We see a similar narrative being played out in the area of trade with regard to, for example, TPP or APEC as presumably America-based or based around America's friends and allies versus RCEP or Free Trade Area of the Asia-Pacific, which are generally seen as being more favorable to China. This plays out also in the debates about the ASEAN +3 versus the East Asia Summit. It plays out in the ARF versus the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, etc. And it's very easy to come to the conclusion that institutions are taking on a kind of zero-sum competition with one another. I want to suggest, however, that they may also reflect the possibility of positive-sum gains built into these, and that institutions may serve a role of socializing members, and they may do so, and I'll get to this as my fundamental conclusion, but by ways of overlapping and being nested one in the other rather than being automatically competitive with one another. So that's the broad direction that I want to take the discussion. In order to do this, because I get paid by a political science department, I have to genuflect at least basically in the direction of political science theory. And I'll just suggest that there are really two very different ways that political theory or international relations theory has approached East Asia. On the one hand, you have realism, neorealism, and links to that school of thought that essentially see power as a zero-sum game. Country A enhances its power. That means that country B has seen a diminution of its power. What counts essentially are material powers in the form of guns, economics, size of population, etc. And there's an assumption that the state is the primary actor in this game. And in the East Asian manifestation of this, those realists would point to the fact that there have been long-standing conflicts in East Asia. The Korean Peninsula is still divided. China-Taiwan has a division across the Taiwan Straits. There are maritime sovereignty disputes in the East China Sea, the South China Seas, etc. And that this remains a debate about who has the stronger military, how are these contests being played out, etc. So the assumption here is a built-in potential for conflict, and more or less the inevitability of conflict if you wait long enough. The flip side of this is what you might think of as neo-institutional arguments, which essentially suggest that power is not zero-sum, but power can be positive-sum. That is to say, my gains and your gains may advance together by virtue of cooperation between us, and that this is at the heart of arguments about the role that economics and economic interdependence can play. And it's also, I would suggest, at the heart of the potential role that institutions can play in reducing conflict and creating positive-sum bases for state-to-state interactions. And the experiences that these individuals, these theoreticians would point to in East Asia would be that East Asia has seen a high collective growth over the last 2 or 3 decades. The countries have grown together. It has not been a matter of competition. There's been a rise in the institutions that have linked these countries together. And there's been a decline in the absolute nature of state-to-state conflicts. As many would argue, Northeast Asia has been without state-to-state conflict, without war, since 1953 in the Korean Armistice, and the rest of East Asia, if you include Southeast Asia, since 1979 with the resolution of the Cambodia difficulties. Very, very briefly, and I promise not to make this a lesson in history, but the new order, the old order that was created at the end of World War II was essentially one in which the United States was the primary architect. It talked about the links between economics and security being the two halves of the same walnut. Both of these, economics and security, were part of American strategy, and the U.S. put in place a whole series of bilateral alliances in Asia, as well as the NATO alliances in Europe, and there was a very strong link between this security containment and the fact that there was economic isolation of the communist bloc or the socialist bloc, including in East Asia, the relatively absolute bar between America's friends or allies trading or investing with China. So this became a line in the sand, if you want, that kept the two sides very far apart. And on the economic side, the U.S. put in place a whole series of organizations, the IMF, the GATT, which subsequently became the WTO, the World Bank, et cetera, all of which constituted the financial order that prevailed across most of Western Europe, North America, and increasingly into other parts of the world. And it's the order into which China and other previously communist or socialist countries have had to enter. And as some of the presentations talked about yesterday, China has done so primarily by virtue of buying into that order and not challenging it in any fundamental way. So, with the end of bipolarity, that changed the security dynamic, and with the rise in the power of global finance, that reduced the capacity of individual countries to isolate their economies from one another. It encouraged a great deal of cross-national investment and trade, as did the end of bipolarity. So the China market suddenly became opened. China began to embrace the Deng Xiaoping reforms, welcomed foreign companies, and there was a great deal of trade going on across Asia that began to reduce that rigid set of divisions between countries that were seen as pro-US or anti-US. So this leads then to the two stories that I want to get to about how to think about East Asia. On the one hand, the sort of positive story is the story of rapid economic growth and a focus on institutional growth across East Asia. East Asia has seen virtually all of the governments in East Asia with leadership that has embraced economic development and the delivery of benefits economically to its citizenry as the prime source of its legitimacy. In effect, the governments from Japan through China, through the Philippines, into Southeast Asia, Korea, South Korea, etc., have all essentially eschewed major military expanses, major monuments to the leaders, the kinds of activities that have gone on heavily in the Middle East, for example, and embraced instead the rapid economic development that has led to the Asian miracle. And we've really seen this as the pervasive ideological embrace of all of the governments of Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, with the exceptions primarily of North Korea on the one hand and Burma, Myanmar on the other. And this, in effect, has created, I think, a win-win dynamic that has been quite beneficial to all of the countries of East Asia, and it has been increasingly supplemented by the development of new regional institutions, which I'll talk about in just a second. The original Asian integration has been largely a bottom-up process. That is to say, it's been driven by corporations. They have embraced what the economists call value chains or regional production networks, but the long and the short of it is lots more trade across borders, lots more focus on the specific capabilities of individual countries to produce components of a finished product. Country A may be very good at providing cheap labor. Country B may be very good at providing inputs such as rubber or particular materials. Country C may be very talented in providing insurance or commerce or transportation. But the end result of this is that we've seen that East Asian miracle that swept East Asia. It's a familiar story for everyone. And basically, we saw Asia jump from roughly 4% of the world's GDP in the 1960s to about 30% today. So this has meant a rising share in world exports. GDP grew at 8 or 10% across most of East Asia. And of course, we've seen lots of claims that the 21st century will be Asia's century. Just various graphics that show this, but we've seen a rapid increase in intra-Asian trade. It's up to levels that are almost equivalent to those of the European Union. About 57% of Asia's trade today goes to other Asian countries. Foreign direct investment was also expanding across this. We've seen the development of a network of free trade agreements that have allowed far more formal trade relationships across the region. And we're now debating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, RCEP, the possibility of a China, Japan, Korea free trade agreement, etc., all of which would presumably enhance all of that intra-Asian trade. Again, a story that's very familiar. This includes foreign direct investment, but the trend in all of these cases is toward rapid expansion. And as I said, China basically accepted the existing institutional order in the course of its rise. It joined the WTO, benefited from membership in the WTO, largely did not challenge existing institutions or did not challenge the institutional order. And it did so even as the old Cold War bipolarity came to an end. As a consequence of this, of course, we saw China's growth expand very rapidly from roughly 5% of the world GDP in 1980 to 16% today. So very rapid explosion in growth. And of course, China has also has replaced the United States as the major trade partner for countries like Japan and South Korea, major security allies of the US, but countries that have become increasingly interdependent with China for their economies. So let me shift then to the discussion of institutional bodies that have been built up in part to link to this economic development. And my central point would be that there were very few intra-Asian regional economic bodies prior to the financial crisis of 1997-98. We had APEC, we had ASEAN, but not much that linked Northeast Asia. And basically, there was a long debate about whether institutions that were going to be created would be institutions for the Asia-Pacific or Trans-Pacific bodies, which certainly was the goal of the United States and many of America's allies, or whether it would be a set of institutions that were for Asians only. And in the wake of the Asian financial crisis, the original impetus was toward institutions that would be for Asians only. ASEAN Plus 3 was the main one of these. We saw then a subsequent development of the East Asia Summit, but again, not much that reached across the Asia-Pacific. That has now changed with the inclusion of the United States and the inclusion of Russia in the East Asia Summit, and we're seeing a revitalization of APEC. But the ultimate point of this is that what I think we see now is a set of institutions across East Asia that are multi-tiered, that are porous, that have different functional orientations periodically, some of which overlap with each other, others of which are exclusive. And we have seen, I think, a great deal of difference in East Asia's approach to institutions from that of Western Europe or even the African Union, where there's one body, you join, you buy into a whole set of rules in NATO or the EU or with the African Union. In East Asia, we have porous membership. We have some organizations that include 10 countries, others that include 16, some that include 3, others that focus primarily on trade, some that include trade and economics and security. And in the long run, I think this is going to be beneficial to the possible role that these institutions can play, and I don't think they're moving toward a zero-sum game. But we have seen the emergence of that narrative of zero-sum competition, particularly over the development of the AIIB. As I'm sure many of you know, about 6 years ago there was agreement to make reforms of the IMF and the weighting of this, but the United States Congress, driven primarily by Republicans who were not anxious to see anything that could be seen as an enhancement of China's power or a diminution of America's power, have refused to accept the reweighting of the IMF, and China, not surprisingly, has gone ahead with the creation of the AIIB. The United States initially reacted with shock and awe and refused to join, encouraged its allies not to join. But of course, as we know, 57 countries, including a number of important Western European countries that are very close to the United States, have joined the AIIB. China has come forward with the One Belt, One Road program. And I think increasingly, as we've seen, again, discussed yesterday, AIIB and now Asian Development Bank and the World Bank are coming to cooperative arrangements in the presentation of their dealings with development and infrastructure activities, all of which suggests that this need not be a zero-sum game. Now, the flip side of this is that we still have incredible security tensions across the region. The headline on this slide basically says that war may be economically irrational, but there are still lots of security tensions. We've got a problem with the Korean Peninsula and the DPRK's missile and nuclear programs. It's driving the United States crazy. I think it's driving many of my friends in China crazy. No one has a very good solution to this. Taiwan, the PRC, have issues of sovereignty and identity, contested territorial issues, etc. And essentially, the argument that says that we are in a situation of a positive-sum economic story is also having to deal with the fact that many of the countries in the region are still perceiving their security relations as somehow zero-sum. And if we have had peace in the region, as Miles Kaler once pointed out, this is the peace of the prudent. These are countries that don't want to get involved in conflict with each other, but they don't necessarily like each other. They have not created a security community in which war is unthinkable. They're simply convinced that in the short run, this would not be a very good idea. So East Asia is still seen by some in the realist camp as the cockpit of great power rivalry. Lots of nuclear powers here, some of the most powerful militaries in the world here. Japan seeming, in the eyes of China, certainly to be building up its military. China has seen rapid expansions in the development of its military. And what I always try to point out to people is that there is no common enemy to the countries of East Asia. Instead, all of the military armaments in East Asia are pointed at one another. Everybody's guns are pointed at other Asians. And I think this is important as a starting point for thinking about this. In addition, Asian views of one another are not necessarily particularly positive. This is not the world's most wonderful graphic, and I don't help by my interjections, but South Korean and Chinese perceptions of Japan, here on the bottom left, quite negative, 25% positive in South Korea, 12% positive in China. But South Korea's views of China are quite positive, whereas Japanese views of China are quite negative. Japanese views of South Korea are not particularly positive. So this has been terribly difficult for gaining a measure of cooperation. And it seems to me that all three countries in particular have been deeply imbued recently with long and deep stretches of nationalism. It's become important for the domestic political base of all of the leadership in these three countries to treat the others as potentially challenging or threatening. And we've seen an outbreak of some xenophobia. And there's been a stalling of the trilateral meetings among the leaders of these three countries. They had been going on since 2008, suddenly were stalled for about 3 years. But ever the optimist, I point out the fact that they have now begun to resume these meetings. And it seems to me that even Japan, Korea, and China, with their degrees of animosity toward one another, are moving in the direction of recognizing that they have reasons to cooperate rather than reasons necessarily to be hostile to one another. The last central point that I want to raise is this whole question of power transition. It was raised by one or more of the speakers, the keynote speakers yesterday. Are we in something called a Thucydides trap? Are we in a situation where a rising China and a diminished United States are likely to move toward confrontation with one another? And are we in a situation where the United States is responding to China's rise by its repositioning? Certainly the story about the American pivot or the Obama pivot to Asia has been heavily portrayed in military terms. It's involved the movement of greater ships and aircraft by the United States into the Asia Pacific, even though the United States has tried to argue that the pivot is multidimensional and has a free trade agreement component to it. It has economic engagement as part of it. It is not designed to contain China. It's designed to engage the United States with the economically most powerful region of the world. But there is always that military piece of the repositioning that I think has continued to gain a great deal of attention across the region, particularly as the United States domestically has found its economy in deep trouble and has been facing high levels of confrontation between Republicans and Democrats over whether to shrink the budget as Republicans want or expand the budget. And if the budget is not expanding, the United States' capability to do things like TPP go down very dramatically. There is the whole question of whether America is in decline, and certainly many across the region, particularly after the Lehman shock of 2008, 2009, and the financial crisis, took this as a sign that the United States was in decline. It was deeply engaged in wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and dancing around the wars in Libya and Syria. And it seems as though, despite the articulation of an Asian pivot, the United States policymakers are spending far more of their time focused on the Middle East than they are on East Asia. And the risk is that security tensions may begin to spill over and begin affecting trade, begin affecting participation in international organizations, begin playing out in reduced free trade across security tension lines. And we've seen countries like Japan pulling back on their investments in China. And the risk is that some of the security tensions will be problematic. We have, as I said, seen a final resurgence of the trilateral meetings. The finance ministers, the foreign ministers rather, just recently met. It's expected that the summit again will take place in 2016 probably in late November, early December in Tokyo. And we're seeing a perhaps resurgent interest in the trilateral arrangements between Japan, China, and South Korea on an economic front, but also allowing the leaders to begin cooperating in ways that will perhaps reduce tensions. But at the same time, the United States is pressing for closer security cooperation between itself and Japan and the ROK. So again, we have this story of competing institutional arrangements, but my bet is almost inevitably on the ways in which cooperative institutions can perhaps mitigate conflict. So what I want to suggest is that we keep these East Asian tensions, which are certainly rife today, in perspective. Keep in mind that there have not been any wars. There are normalized ties. Borders are being settled. Military spending across the region remains quite low by comparison to other regions of the world as a percentage of GDP. And we've also seen lots of areas of cooperation, particularly outside of the region. The United States-China cooperation on the Iran nuclear deal, on the climate change issues, along with India. All of these things suggest ways in which some of these countries are quite anxious to mitigate the security tensions and work toward cooperative arrangements. So this last graphic has two very different sets of institutions, but the central point that I would want to make is that, as I pointed out earlier, we are not seeing organizations created with zero-sum memberships and you're either in one or out of it and in another or out of it. Instead, we see all sorts of meshing and interactions, ASEAN superimposed with the ASEAN +3 by the East Asia Summit. We've got APEC as another organization. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a whole series of potential trade agreements. And it seems to me that these institutions have the capacity to begin dealing with problems, creating a mechanism for socialization of membership and moving toward cooperative arrangements. They're not going to eliminate national tensions, but they do have the capacity, I think, to mitigate them to some extent. So the last point I want to make goes back to theory, and that is to say that so much of the discussion that we have in this Thucydides trap or the power transition argument or in neorealism is that the predictions that are made have the risk of becoming a kind of teleology at the end, that conflict is inevitable and we might as well get used to it and we might as well prepare for it. And as we prepare for it, we create a mindset in the minds of others that suggests that, yes, indeed, the other country is building up against us and therefore we must build up in return. It seems to me that it's important to reverse that notion of a coercive diplomacy moving toward escalation and instead begin to work toward a set of institutions that can try to mitigate many of these conflicts, provide a basis for mutual trust and cooperation, and eventually move East Asia toward the goal that I think all of us are looking for, which is that mutual cooperation, that sense of trust. It's not going to come automatically and easily. We're not going to be seeing kumbaya next week, but it does seem to me that we have the possibility of moving incrementally in those directions, and I think institutions and the development of regional norms can play a positive role in that regard. So let me stop on that note. Thank you very much.